UNC's at-home learning series for literacy. Today's lesson is for all our 7th graders out there, though anyone is welcome to tune in. This lesson is the 4th in this week's series. My name is Mrs. Alley, and I'm a 7th grade Tennessee teacher. I'm so excited to be your teacher for this lesson. Welcome to my virtual classroom. If you didn't see our previous lesson, you can find it at www.tn.gov/education. You can still tune into today's lesson if you haven't seen any of our others, but it might be more fun if you first go back and watch our other lessons, since today we'll be talking about what we've learned previously. Today we will use the language in the poem to better understand Emily Dickinson's view of trains. Before we get started, to participate fully in today's lesson, you will need a few things: a pencil, paper, a surface to write on, and the student packet for ELA Grade 7 Lesson 14, which you can find at www.tn.gov/education. Let's get started. Today, our lesson will focus on connotative analysis of vocabulary and the tone in the poem to begin to understand Emily Dickinson's view on trains. This has been a week of mystery, hasn't it? We've been working hard to use clues that Dickinson has given us to not only attempt to figure out what the poem is about, but to also figure out what she is saying about trains as they are beginning to be used for both carrying goods and people across the country. In our previous lesson, we read an informational text about the rise of the railroad in the mid-1800s to early 1900s to gain knowledge about the time period Emily Dickinson lived in and how the railroad impacted the United States. We learned the railroad significantly changed the way the economy developed and how people traveled. The railroad could transport both goods and people over long distances in a much shorter time than wagons and horses. It helped the United States expand manufacturing and travel. Today we're going to analyze how the words Dickinson uses in her poem to describe the train impact our understanding of her perspective about trains. We will also think about how she uses the poem's structure to make the whole piece sound like a train. We will begin with me showing you what that looks like, and then there will be time for you to practice on your own with my support. Finally, I will assign you independent work that you can complete after the video ends. All right, let's get started. Today, we are going to reread The Railway Train by Emily Dickinson. Just like before, we'll have a little different focus. This time, we're going to focus on the first 2 stanzas of the poem for a few minutes. Let's reread them together. Remember, the first 2 stanzas have the pattern of da-dum, da-dum, the iambic pentameter. I like to see it lap the miles and lick the valleys up, and stop to feed itself at tanks, and then prodigious step. Around a pile of mountains, and supercilious pier, in shanties by the sides of roads, and then a quarry pair. Now, remember, as we talk today, make sure you continue to take notes. The questions and answers you should focus on and include in your notes will be posted on a slide. I'll show you what I mean. Here in the first stanza, we see the word prodigious. I like to see it lap the miles and lick the valleys up and stop to feed itself at tanks, and then prodigious step. What does the word prodigious mean? What action is the word describing? I think we have to read the whole phrase again to figure this out. And then prodigious step around a pile of mountains. Well, she's describing how the train steps around the mountains. But I know she doesn't mean that literally, since trains aren't living things with feet like horses. So she's saying something about the train going over the mountains. Mountains are very tall and can be gigantic and wide, so it would have been harder for horses and wagons to travel through them. Wagons would either have to stop at the mountain or they would have to go around the mountain, which could take weeks longer. But for a train, it would be much easier, like we learned in the article in the previous lesson. It has more power, and people could create tunnels for the train to go through the mountain instead of around it. So it would be like if the train did have legs and could just walk over the mountains. It would have to be gigantic to do that. Let me read the line again. And then prodigious step around a pile of mountains. Oh, I got it now. Prodigious must mean enormous, like the size of the step and the size of the train. Yes, that makes sense. Trains are much larger than the horses and wagons that people used before. Please be sure to write down the word prodigious and its meaning, enormous. Did you notice how I reread the lines that had the vocabulary word in it? Did you notice I restated what the line was about? Then I imagined the literal meaning of prodigious and realized the author must have meant something more than that meaning. I also used what I know about mountains and the way to travel before the train was invented to dig deeper for the meaning of prodigious in this line. I like to see it lap the miles and lick the valleys up, and stop to feed itself at tanks, and then prodigious step. Around a pile of mountains and supercilious pier, in shanties by the sides of roads, and then a quarry pair. What does the use of the word prodigious suggest about Dickinson's point of view about trains? Prodigious is a sophisticated word to use, and it's important to know that Dickinson didn't just use a word like big or huge. It seems like Dickinson is a bit in awe of the train, right? I can picture her standing next to it, like some of the pictures we saw in the article last time, and just thinking, wow, the machine is incredible. It's so much more powerful than our horses. It's like a giant. I think the word prodigious shows Dickinson is impressed by the train because of its size, power, and ability to do things that horses can't. Did you notice how I considered how the author could have used different words to help me focus on and why she would use a specific word? Here again, I use a mental picture of Dickinson standing next to the train to help me think about her point of view about the trains. You can use similar strategies when you encounter unfamiliar words. Really think about it to figure it out. Don't just skip the word you don't know. All right, are you ready to try now? Let's work together on the next part. Let's go to stanza 2. Read in your head as I read aloud. Around a pile of mountains and supercilious pier, in shanties by the sides of roads, and then a quarry pair. What do you think supercilious means in this second stanza? What can you do to infer the meaning of supercilious? Let's read the stanza again. Around a pile of mountains and supercilious pier, in shanties by the sides of roads, and then a quarry pair. Yes, we can reread the line. Let's do that. Together now. And supercilious pier, in shanties by the sides of roads. What action is the word describing? Correct. Supercilious describes how the train piers or looks into the shanties, the rundown shelters. What is Dickinson saying about how the train feels when it is peering into shanties? Around a pile of mountains and supercilious pier, in shanties by the sides of roads, and then a quarry pair. So many possibilities, right? Is it curious? Sad? Concerned? Let's use another strategy. Do you see a word you know inside of supercilious? Yes, there is the word super, which makes me think of the word superior. Do you know what the word superior means? True. Superior means better than something else. So maybe supercilious has to do with being or feeling better than something else. Let's read the line again. And supercilious peer in shanties by the sides of roads. What does Dickinson mean when she says the train peers at the shanties in a supercilious manner? Go ahead and write your response. Great. The train thinks it's so much better than anything else that it can just look into people's houses as it steams along the track. It acts disdainful or snobby. That might make sense, right? The train is this new technology, so it would seem much fancier than the shabby homes it passes. And recall from our previous lessons how elaborate the passenger trains at the time could be, with their sleeping compartments and dining cars? If the train were a person, what would Dickinson say about the person being supercilious? I agree. That person probably isn't acting like a nice person if they think they are better than everyone else. Or maybe they are conceited. Now, how would you feel about someone when you combine supercilious with the thought of that person looking into shanties? Yes, I can think of a few words. Rude and stuck up come to mind. Now, let's take it back to the train then. Write your response to what do you think supercilious means in the second stanza? Around a pile of mountains and supercilious pier, in shanties by the sides of roads, and then a quarry pair. What does the second stanza reveal about Dickinson's perspective about the train? Write your response. I would say that it's definitely not something positive, right? She may think that the train may be new, shiny, and powerful, but it reminds her not everyone benefits from it, like the people who live in the shanties. But you may be thinking, wait a minute, wasn't Dickinson just saying earlier in the poem how impressed she was with the train when she used the word prodigious? Yes, she does seem to have two different ideas about the train in this poem. Dickinson describes a train as prodigious and supercilious. What do these word choices suggest about her attitude toward the train? Write down your ideas. There are several ways to answer this question. It seems like she sees the train as some big, new, overbearing thing that thinks it's the best thing ever. It is true that the train brought faster ways to transport people and goods, and that it could go through mountains instead of over them. She might be saying we need to be careful with new technology because we may overlook certain things just because it can do amazing things. Still, it does seem that overall, she admires the train. Remember, this poem was written at a time where the train was a brand new technology. Before the train, horses were the main mode of transportation. Just imagine a major mode of transportation moving from a nice, quiet little horse to this large, noisy steam engine. Some people might not like that, but others would be excited. Let's read the entire poem again. This time, I only want you to listen to the rhythm. I like to see it lap the miles and lick the valleys up, and stop to feed itself at tanks, and then prodigious step. Around a pile of mountains and supercilious pier, in shanties by the sides of roads, and then a quarry pair. To fit its sides and crawl between, complaining all the while, in horrid hooting stanza, then chase itself downhill. And neigh like Boanerges, then punctual as a star, stop, docile and omnipotent, at its own stable door. Good. The last stanza sounds totally different, doesn't it? Let's talk about that for a minute. The first 3 stanzas are written in something called iambic pentameter. In other words, it has a beat like this. I like to see it lap the miles and lick the valleys up, and stop to feed itself at tanks, and then prodigious step. Around a pile of mountains and supercilious pier, in shanties by the sides of roads, and then a quarry pair. To fit its sides and crawl between, complaining all the while, in horrid hooting stanza, then chase itself downhill. What images come to mind when you hear the first 3 stanzas read the way I read them? Awesome. It could be a heartbeat or a clock, huh? Like it has a rhythm. Now listen to the last stanza. And neigh like Boanerges, then punctual as a star, stop docile and omnipotent, at its own stable door. Wow. What words do you see in this final stanza that make you slow down when you read it? Great. Words like Boanerges and omnipotent, and even stop. They just don't fit the same rhythm, do they? How does this change in structure add to the image of a train and the message of the poem? Record your ideas on paper. Let's read the poem one more time. I like to see it lap the miles and lick the valleys up, and stop to feed itself at tanks, and then prodigious step around a pile of mountains, and supercilious peer in shanties by the sides of roads, and then a quarry pair to fit its sides and crawl between, complaining all the while in horrid hooting stanza, then chase itself downhill. And neigh like Boanerges, then punctual as a star, stop, docile and omnipotent, at its own stable door. Great! The first three stanzas make us think of the sound of a fast-moving train. Kind of like the train when it's going down the track making this sound. Chuck, 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 chuck. On the other hand, the final stanza reminds us of a train slowing down when it's about to stop. The fourth stanza not only changes in rhythm, but also Dickinson's feelings toward the train. She uses the words omnipotent, docile, and punctual as a star to describe the train. Do you remember the meaning of omnipotent? Yes, it means all-powerful or godlike. What about docile? It means calm or obedient. And what does the phrase punctual as a star mean? Right, it means always on time. For your independent work today, think about what we've talked about and review your notes. Then write a paragraph discussing Dickinson's use of the fourth stanza to reinforce how she feels about the train. Take a moment to write down any words from the last stanza you may want to use. I'll read it for you again. And neigh like Boanerges, then punctual as a star, stop, docile and omnipotent, at its own stable door. Again, I want you to take a moment to write down any words from the last stanza that you may want to use when writing a paragraph discussing Dickinson's use of the fourth stanza to reinforce how she feels about the train. Did you get what you needed? Good. I enjoyed working on analyzing the words and structure of The Railway Train with you today. Thank you for inviting me into your home. I look forward to seeing you in our next lesson in Tennessee's At Home Learning series. Bye.